The evening sun painted the Seattle airport in shades of orange and gold as Lin Chen made her way through the bustling terminal. At 58, she moved with a quiet purpose, her carry-on bag rolling behind her with a rhythmic click against the polished floor. Her silver-streaked black hair was pulled back in a practical bun, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. To anyone watching, she was just another traveler, perhaps someone's mother or aunt heading off to visit family. Gate B-17 was crowded when she arrived. Business people tapped away on laptops, families tried to contain restless children, and college students dozed with earbuds in place. Lin found a seat near the window and pulled out her worn paperback, a mystery novel she'd been meaning to finish for weeks. Attention passengers of Flight 2753 to Washington, D.C. We will begin. Boarding in approximately 15 minutes. Please have your boarding passes ready. Lin checked her watch out of habit. Right on time. She'd made this cross-country journey dozens of times over the years. But something about today felt different. Maybe it was the dream she'd had last night, of rushing wind and metal wings gleaming in the sun. Dreams from her old life occasionally surfaced like this, remnants of a career most people would never understand. When her group was called, Lin joined the line, ticket in hand. The gate agent smiled at her, the kind of automatic politeness reserved for ordinary passengers. Enjoy your flight, ma'am. Inside the plane, Lin found her seat, 12F, a window spot toward the middle of the aircraft. She stowed her small bag in the overhead compartment and settled in. Tucking her novel into the seat pocket in front of her, a young man in a business suit took the aisle seat in her row, nodding briefly before returning to his phone. Good evening, folks. This is Captain Reynolds speaking. Flight time to DC should be about 5 hours and 20 minutes. Weather looks clear most of the way, though we're tracking some systems over the northern Rockies. Sit back, relax, and we'll get you there as quickly and smoothly as possible. Lin leaned her head against the window as the plane backed away from the gate. After all these years, she still loved takeoffs, that moment when gravity surrendered and the earth fell away. The engines roared, pressing her gently back into her seat as the plane accelerated down the runway. Then came the lift, that magical instant when tons of metal defied nature and slipped into the sky. The sunset had given way to twilight by the time they reached cruising altitude. Lin declined the offered beverage and instead opened her book, though her mind kept drifting from the words on the page. Tomorrow's meeting at the Department of Defense was supposedly routine, just another consultation on legacy systems, but the urgency in the director's voice during their phone call had suggested, otherwise 2 hours into the flight. Lin had just dozed off when the plane gave a sudden lurch. Her eyes snapped open as her body tensed with the instincts of someone who understood flight dynamics all too well. This wasn't ordinary turbulence. The seatbelt sign chimed on immediately, followed by the captain's voice, noticeably more controlled than before. Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some unexpected weather. Nothing to worry about, but we're going to experience some bumps for a while. Please return to your seats and keep your seatbelts fastened until the sign is turned off. The businessman beside Lin gripped his armrests, knuckles whitening as the plane shuddered again. Bad one, huh? He said, attempting a smile that looked more like a grimace. It's all right, Lin replied, her voice calm. Aircraft are designed to handle much worse. She didn't add that she knew this because she'd helped design test protocols for military planes that would make this turbulence feel like a gentle rocking. Some habits of secrecy never quite died. The plane dropped suddenly, eliciting gasps throughout the cabin. Overhead bins rattled, and somewhere a child began to cry. Lin remained still, her hands relaxed in her lap, gaze fixed on the dark clouds outside her window. Lightning flashed in the distance, briefly illuminating the massive wing. 20 minutes of increasingly rough air passed before the captain's voice returned, now with an edge that made Lin sit up straighter. Folks, this weather system is proving more challenging than expected. As a precaution, we're going to divert to Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska, where we can wait out the storm and have our aircraft inspected. We should be on the ground in about 40 minutes. A ripple of concerned murmurs spread through the cabin. The flight attendants moved through the aisle, their practiced smiles firmly in place as they reassured nervous passengers. An Air Force base? The businessman asked. Can commercial flights even land there? In emergencies, yes, Lin said. Military bases often have the longest, most well-maintained runways available. What she didn't say was that she knew Elmendorf all too well. 20 years ago, she'd spent months there, observing test flights of prototype aircraft, planes that had eventually evolved into the stealth fighters that now defended American airspace. Those had been long days and longer nights, working through complex problems that sometimes seemed impossible to solve. As the plane began its descent, Lynn's thoughts drifted to faces she hadn't seen in years. The test pilots who'd trusted their lives to her calculations, the mechanics who had implemented her team's designs, the commanders who'd eventually pinned medals on her civilian clothes when the project succeeded beyond everyone's expectations. The cabin lights dimmed briefly as the plane banked, beginning its approach pattern. Through her window, Lynn could make out the distinctive layout of the Air Force base, the parallel runways, the hangars set back from the tarmac, the control tower rising against the darkening Alaskan sky. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach to Elmendorf. The weather here is clear, temperature 48 degrees. Please remain in your seats with seatbelts fastened until we've come to a complete stop at the gate. Lynn felt a flutter of something like anticipation in her chest. It had been 2 decades since she'd set foot on any military installation. After retiring from the Advanced Research Projects Division, she'd deliberately distanced herself from that world, choosing instead a quiet life of occasional consulting and gardening at her small house outside Portland. The plane touched down with barely a bump, the pilot's skill evident in the smooth landing. As they taxied toward a remote part of the airfield, Lynn could see military vehicles already positioning themselves around the area where they would park. A flood of memories washed over her, countless landings on bases around the world, always under the shroud of classified operations. So many years of her life spent in places the public rarely saw, working on aircraft most people would never know existed. The businessman beside her was already on his phone, rescheduling meetings and explaining the delay. Other passengers were doing the same, their faces reflecting various degrees of annoyance and concern. None of them had any idea who sat among them in seat 12F. To them, Lynn was just another inconvenienced traveler, a quiet older woman who had mysteriously remained calm during the turbulence. That's exactly how she preferred it. The years of working in shadows had taught her the value of anonymity. Even her name badge at the DoD meeting tomorrow would simply read L. Chen, engineering consultant. No mention of Project Nighthawk or the breakthroughs that had changed modern aerial warfare. The plane came to a halt, and the captain's voice returned with instructions about their unexpected stopover. They would deplane using mobile stairs, then board buses to a passenger facility while the aircraft was inspected. Lynn gathered her belongings and prepared to step back, however briefly, into a world she had left behind. As she joined the line shuffling toward the exit, she had no way of knowing that her carefully maintained anonymity was about to be shattered, that within hours, her presence on this base would cause a stir among the very pilots who flew the fighters she had helped create. For now, she was just a passenger from seat 12F, quietly waiting her turn to step out into the cool Alaskan evening. The bus from the airplane to the base facility was oddly quiet. Lynn watched through the window as they passed hangars with massive doors, their shadows stretching long in the evening light. Elmendorf hadn't changed much in 20 years. The same practical buildings, the same clean efficiency, the same sense of purpose in everyone's movements. An airman stood at the front of the bus, a young woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Folks, we'll be taking you to our visitor center where you can wait comfortably. The maintenance crew is checking your aircraft now. We apologize for the inconvenience and will keep you updated on the situation." The bus stopped outside a single-story building with the Air Force insignia displayed above the entrance. Lynn filed out with the other passengers, her legs stiff from the flight. The cool Alaska air filled her lungs, carrying the familiar scent of jet fuel that she'd once found as common as morning coffee. Inside, the visitor center was surprisingly comfortable. A large room with rows of chairs, vending machines, and a small desk staffed by Air Force personnel. Lynn found a quiet corner and settled in, placing her carry-on bag beside her feet. A young lieutenant moved through the crowd, clipboard in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, could I have your attention? We're creating a passenger list for base security. When I call your name, please raise your hand and I'll bring you a temporary visitor badge." Lynn observed the officer. He couldn't be more than 25, with a freshly pressed uniform and the earnest expression of someone new to authority. As he worked his way alphabetically through the list, Lynn prepared for her turn, already reaching for her ID. "Chen, Lynn," the lieutenant called. Lynn raised her hand and he made his way over, offering a polite smile. "May I see your ID, ma'am?" She handed him her driver's license. The lieutenant glanced at it, then at his list, then back at her with no sign of recognition. Of course not, she thought. This young man would have been in elementary school when she was last involved with the Air Force. "Thank you, Ms. Chen. Here's your visitor badge. Please keep it visible while on base." He handed her a plastic clip-on badge with "Visitor" printed in bold letters. Lynn clipped it to her jacket and thanked him with a nod. For a moment she felt a strange twinge of disappointment. Once, her arrival at a base like this would have meant urgent calls to commanding officers and hurried briefings. Now she was just another stranded passenger. The businessman from the plane, his badge identified him as Robert Turner, dropped into the chair beside her with a heavy sigh. "This is a disaster. I'm going to miss my morning meeting in D.C. These things happen," Lynn said. "Better safe than sorry when it comes to aircraft, I suppose." He loosened his tie and checked his phone again. "No signal in here. Military security, I guess." "Standard procedure," Lynn confirmed. "There should be a secure Wi-Fi network for visitors, though." "Just ask one of the officers." Robert gave her a curious look. "You seem to know your way around these places." Lynn shrugged, keeping her expression neutral. "I've traveled a lot." A commotion at the entrance drew their attention. A tall man in a flight suit had entered, his weathered face scanning the room. The patch on his chest identified him as Colonel David Harker. The name tickled something in Lynn's memory, but she couldn't place it. The colonel spoke briefly with the lieutenant, who pointed toward the desk at the front of the room. As Harker passed through the crowd, his eyes swept over the passengers without interest. "Wonder what's going on," Robert murmured. "Probably just checking on our situation," Lynn replied, though something about the colonel's demeanor suggested otherwise. He moved with the focused intensity she recognized from test pilots, people who lived in a world where split-second decisions meant life or death. An hour passed. Some passengers dozed in their chairs while others paced or chatted quietly. Outside the windows, darkness had fallen completely, the base lights creating islands of brightness in the Alaskan night. Lynn had just returned from the restroom when she noticed a small group of officers huddled near the entrance, occasionally glancing toward the passengers. Something about their manner, the quiet urgency, the repeated consultations of a tablet computer, triggered her professional instincts. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just about a diverted commercial flight. The door opened again and a new officer entered, an older woman with silver hair and the insignia of a brigadier general. Lynn froze mid-step. She knew that face. Grace Wilson had been a major when they'd worked together on Project Nighthawk, one of the few people who'd understood both the engineering and strategic implications of what they were building. The general spoke quietly to Colonel Harker, who nodded and pointed toward the passenger area. Lynn quickly turned away, moving back to her seat. Would Grace even remember her? It had been 2 decades, and they'd only worked together for 11 months during the project's most critical phase. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Harker's voice cut through the murmur of conversations. "I have an update on your situation. The maintenance crew has identified some minor issues with your aircraft that require additional parts. Unfortunately, these won't arrive until morning. We're arranging overnight accommodations for everyone at the base visitor quarters, and your airline is coordinating to have you on your way by tomorrow afternoon." A chorus of groans and complaints rose from the passengers. The colonel raised his hands. "I understand this is inconvenient, but your safety is our priority. We'll provide meals and basic toiletries. If you have medications or special needs, please speak with Lieutenant Diaz at the desk." As the colonel finished speaking, General Wilson was scanning the crowd, her eyes moving methodically across the faces. Lynn kept her expression neutral, though her heart had begun beating faster. She focused on her book, turning a page she hadn't actually read. "Before we move to the quarters, we need to verify everyone's identification one more time," Colonel Harker continued. "Standard procedure for overnight visitors to the base. Please have your ID ready when your name is called." The lieutenant began working through his list again, this time in the presence of the senior officers. When he reached Lynn's name, she raised her hand as before, holding out her driver's license. This time General Wilson was watching. As the lieutenant checked Lynn's ID, the general stepped forward, her brow furrowed slightly. "Ms. Chen," Wilson said, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone who wasn't quite sure but needed to check. "Lynn Chen?" Lynn met her gaze evenly. "Yes?" The general moved closer, studying her face. Forgive me, but did you ever work on aerospace projects? You look familiar? The room seemed to quiet around them, though Lynn knew it was just her heightened awareness. She considered her options quickly. Denial would be simple, but potentially problematic if Grace had already recognized her. Yes, I did, she answered simply. A long time ago. General Wilson's eyes widened slightly. Were you with Advanced Research? Early 2000s? Lynn nodded once. Yes, General. Project Nighthawk, 2003 to 2005. The change in Wilson's demeanor was immediate and striking. She straightened, almost coming to attention despite being the higher-ranking officer. Dr. Chen, I didn't recognize you immediately. It's been many years. Colonel Harker had moved to the general's side, his expression confused. General? Wilson turned to him, lowering her voice but not enough for Lynn to miss her words. Colonel, this is Dr. Lin Chen. She was the lead engineer on the stealth systems for the F-22 program. Her team developed the radar-absorbent materials and surface geometry that made our current fighters possible. Harker's eyes snapped to Lynn with new interest. Nighthawk? You're Nighthawk Chen? The nickname brought a rush of memories. Lynn hadn't heard it in so long that it sounded almost foreign now. The project name had somehow become attached to her within the military, though she'd never used it herself. That was a long time ago, Lynn said quietly, aware that other passengers were beginning to look curiously in their direction. Robert Turner beside her was openly staring. Ma'am, Colonel Harker said with sudden respect, it's an honor. Your work saved pilots' lives, mine included. Lynn felt heat rising to her cheeks. This was exactly the kind of attention she'd avoided for years. Thank you, Colonel, but really, we have F-22 stationed here now. Wilson interrupted, her professional demeanor giving way to genuine excitement. The 477th Fighter Group, they fly the planes you helped create. That's nice to know, Lynn said carefully. But I was just one member of a large team. That's not how the story is told, Wilson said with a small smile. Not at all how it's told. Lynn could see the questions forming in the eyes of nearby passengers. The businessman beside her was looking at her as if she'd suddenly transformed into someone else entirely. General, Lynn said quietly, I appreciate the recognition, but I'm just trying to get to Washington for a meeting. Wilson nodded, understanding flickering in her eyes. Of course, Dr. Chen. We'll make sure you're comfortable tonight. She turned to Colonel Harker. David, make sure Dr. Chen gets one of the distinguished visitor quarters. Yes, ma'am, he replied, then looked back at Lynn. It would be an honor if you'd consider visiting the hangars tomorrow before your flight leaves. Some of our pilots would be very interested in meeting you. Before Lynn could formulate a polite refusal, Robert Turner leaned forward. Excuse me, but what exactly did she do? Colonel Harker gave him a measuring look. Sir, that information It's fine, Lynn interrupted. Most of it was declassified years ago. She turned to Robert with a small shrug. I helped design some aspects of stealth aircraft. Nothing particularly exciting. The lie felt smooth on her tongue after years of practice. Much easier than explaining how she had revolutionized the mathematics of radar cross-section reduction, or how her team's innovations had changed the fundamental approach to stealth technology. As the passengers began to gather their belongings for the move to the overnight quarters, Lynn could feel the shift in the air around her. Word was spreading through whispers and glances. The unassuming woman from Seat 12F wasn't so ordinary after all. For the first time in many years, Lynn felt the weight of her past accomplishments settling back onto her shoulders. By tomorrow, the young F-22 pilots on this base would know she was here. The quiet anonymity she'd cultivated for so long had just begun to crack, right when she least expected it. The visitor quarters turned out to be a small but comfortable room with a neatly made bed, desk, and private bathroom. Lynn set her bag down and sat on the edge of the mattress, suddenly tired in a way that had nothing to do with the long flight or diverted plans. Being recognized had stirred up memories she'd carefully packed away years ago. She kicked off her shoes and lay back, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow's meeting at the Department of Defense would need to be rescheduled. She should call her contact there, but for now she just needed a moment of quiet. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Chen, it's General Wilson. Lynn sighed, then stood and smoothed her blouse before opening the door. Grace Wilson stood in the hallway, now wearing her service dress uniform rather than the flight suit from earlier. I hope I'm not disturbing you, Wilson said. Not at all. General. Lynn stepped back, gesturing for her to enter. Please, call me Grace. Wilson smiled as she stepped into the room. It's been 20 years. I think we can drop the formalities. Lynn returned the smile, though hers felt more tentative. Grace, then. I wanted to apologize for putting you on the spot back there. Wilson took the chair by the desk while Lynn returned to sitting on the bed. I was just so surprised to see you. It was like seeing a ghost from the past. No harm done, Lynn said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Her carefully maintained privacy had definitely been breached. Wilson leaned forward, her eyes bright with genuine curiosity. What have you been doing all these years? After you left the program, there were all sorts of rumors. Some said you'd gone to work for a private aerospace company. Others thought you'd moved to a black project so classified even we couldn't know about it. Lynn laughed softly. Nothing so dramatic. I taught engineering at Portland State for a while, did some consulting work. These days I mostly garden and read mystery novels. She didn't mention her occasional top-secret consultations with the DoD, or the patent she still developed in her home workshop. Seriously? Wilson looked almost disappointed. With your mind? That's like using a supercomputer to check email. Lynn shrugged. I had my time. 20 years of pushing boundaries was enough. I wanted quiet, Wilson nodded slowly. I understand, still. She trailed off, then reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out a small notebook. The reason I came by, beyond just saying hello to an old colleague, is that we're having a small reception tonight in the officers' club. Nothing formal, just dinner for some of the senior staff and a few visitors from Washington. I'd be honored if you'd join us, Lynn hesitated. I appreciate the invitation, but I'm rather tired. It's been a long day. Of course. Wilson tucked the notebook away, though I should warn you that word of your presence has already spread. Colonel Harker mentioned it to his executive officer, who told the squadron commander, and well, she smiled apologetically. By morning, every pilot on this base will know that Nighthawk Chen is here. Lynn sighed. I was afraid of that. They've all studied your work, you know. Not by name, of course. Most of the specific attribution is still classified. But the principles you developed, the innovations you introduced, they're foundational now. Taught at the Air Force Academy and every flight school. Wilson's voice carried unmistakable respect. What you did changed everything. It was a team effort, Lynn said automatically. The same response she'd given for years whenever her work was praised. Yes, you led that team. Wilson stood, straightening her uniform. The dinner starts at 7 in the officers' club. Nothing fancy, just come as you are. I'll have someone escort you if you decide to join us. She moved to the door, then paused. And Lynn, it really is good to see you again. After Wilson left, Lynn lay back down, her mind racing. She'd spent so long avoiding recognition, deflecting questions about her past, keeping that chapter of her life neatly separated from her present. Now the walls between those worlds were crumbling, and she wasn't sure how she felt about it. At 6:55, there was another knock on her door. Lynn had showered and changed into the one nice outfit she had in her carry-on. Black slacks and a simple blue blouse. She'd decided that hiding in her room would only make things more awkward tomorrow. A young airman stood in the hallway, back straight and expression professionally neutral. Good evening, Dr. Chen. I'm Airman Patel. General Wilson asked me to escort you to the officers' club. Thank you, Airman. Lynn followed her through the building and outside, where a military vehicle waited. The night air was crisp, stars bright in the clear Alaskan sky. In the distance, she could see the silhouettes of hangars and the control tower, its lights blinking rhythmically. The officers' club was a low building with warm light spilling from its windows. As they approached, Lynn could hear the murmur of voices and soft music. Airman Patel opened the door for her, and the conversation inside briefly paused as heads turned toward the entrance. Grace Wilson detached herself from a small group and came forward to greet Lynn. You made it. I'm glad. Lynn nodded, trying not to notice how many people were watching her. Thank you for the invitation. Let me introduce you to some people, Wilson said, guiding her toward a cluster of officers near a table laden with food. Though I suspect several of them already know exactly who you are. The next hour passed in a blur of introductions and conversations. Lynn found herself surrounded by Air Force personnel of various ranks, all seemingly eager to meet her. She answered questions about her current life, but deflected most inquiries about her past work, citing classification concerns even though many details had been declassified years ago. Colonel Harker appeared at her elbow with a glass of water. He'd remembered she didn't drink alcohol. "Doing all right, Dr. Chen? Not too overwhelming?" "I'm fine, Colonel, thank you." Lin took the water gratefully, though I wasn't expecting quite this level of interest. Harker smiled. "You're a legend, ma'am, especially to the fighter pilots." "That seems like an exaggeration," Lin said, uncomfortable with the description. "Not at all. May I tell you a story?" At Lin's nod, he continued. 10 years ago, I was flying a night mission over contested airspace. I can't say where, but it was tense. Enemy air defenses were top-notch. I was piloting an F-22, using all the stealth capabilities to their fullest. We knew their radar systems were actively searching, but they couldn't find us. My wingman and I completed our mission and returned safely, entirely undetected. He paused, his expression serious. Later, we learned that the enemy had deployed their newest radar system specifically to try to catch our Raptors. They failed. The technology you helped develop kept us invisible, kept us safe. He raised his glass slightly. "So yes, Dr. Chen, you're a legend to people like me. You saved lives without ever setting foot in a cockpit." Lin felt her cheeks warm. "I appreciate that, Colonel. But as I keep saying, team effort." "Yes, I know," he smiled. "You sound exactly like the stories about you." Before Lin could respond, the door to the officers' club opened, and a group of younger officers entered, men and women in their 20s and early 30s, wearing flight suits with squadron patches. They paused just inside, scanning the room until one of them spotted Colonel Harker and pointed him out to the others. "Ah," Harker said with a knowing look. "The pilots have arrived. I may have mentioned you'd be here." The young officers approached, their excitement barely contained beneath a veneer of military professionalism. Lin recognized the look in their eyes, the same combination of curiosity and respect she'd seen in young engineers when she used to give lectures at technical conferences. Woman at the front of the group stepped forward. Her name patch identified her as Captain Vivian Nguyen. "Dr. Chen, I'm Captain Nguyen, 477th Fighter Group. It's an honor to meet you." Lin shook her hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. "The honor is mine, Captain. We heard you were on base and—" Nguyen glanced at her fellow pilots who were watching eagerly. "Well, we weren't going to miss the chance to meet you." A tall man beside Nguyen nodded enthusiastically. "Ma'am, we've all studied the technical manuals for the F-22 stealth systems. Your work is the reason we can fly missions that would be suicide in any other aircraft." Lin looked at the group of young pilots, seeing the genuine admiration in their faces. These were the people who trusted their lives to the technology she had helped create. For the first time in years, she felt a surge of pride that wasn't immediately followed by the urge to deflect or minimize. "Would you tell us about the early days of the program?" another pilot asked. "The parts that aren't classified, of course." Lin glanced at Colonel Harker, who nodded encouragingly. "I suppose I could share a few stories." They moved to a corner of the room where several couches and chairs were arranged in a loose circle. The pilots settled in, their attention focused entirely on Lin as she began to speak about the challenges they'd faced in the early development stages of what would become the F-22's stealth systems. The fundamental problem was mathematical as much as physical, she explained, finding herself slipping back into the teaching role she'd once enjoyed. "We needed to create shapes and surfaces that would scatter radar waves in very specific patterns, preventing the signal from returning to its source." As she spoke, Lin noticed other officers drifting closer to listen. Even some of the civilian passengers from the flight had found their way to the officers' club and were watching from the periphery. Robert Turner, the businessman from seat 12B, stood near the bar with an expression of astonishment as he finally understood who had been sitting next to him on the plane. For 2 hours, Lin answered questions and shared anecdotes from her time on the project. She found herself enjoying the exchange more than she'd expected. These young pilots were sharp, asking intelligent questions that showed they truly understood the principles behind the technology they used every day. As the evening drew to a close, Captain Nguyen approached Lin one last time. "Dr. Chen, tomorrow morning we have 3 F-22s scheduled for a training flight. We would be honored if you would visit the hangar before we take off, see what your work has become." Lynn looked at the young pilot's eager face and found she couldn't refuse. "I'd like that, Captain." As the gathering began to break up, Lynn made her way toward the exit, feeling oddly energized despite the long day. General Wilson caught up with her at the door. "That went well," Wilson said with a smile. "I haven't seen the pilots that excited since the Secretary of Defense visited last year." Lynn laughed softly. "It was unexpected, but nice." "You know," Wilson said thoughtfully, "there's a whole generation of engineers and pilots who have built their careers on the foundation you created. Yet most of them have never heard your name." "That's how I wanted it," Lynn replied. "The work was what mattered, not who did it." Wilson nodded. "Still, seeing you with those pilots tonight, maybe it's time they knew the face behind the technology they trust with their lives." Lynn didn't answer immediately, looking out at the dark base with its scattered lights. The aircraft she had helped design were out there, sleeping in their hangars. Tomorrow she would see them up close for the first time in decades. "Maybe," she finally said. "We'll see." Lynn woke before dawn, the unfamiliar bed and the weight of anticipation making deep sleep impossible. She stood at the small window of her room, watching as the first pale light crept across the Alaskan sky. Somewhere on this base, pilots were already preparing for their morning flights, running through checklists and studying weather reports. After a quick shower, she dressed in the same clothes she'd worn yesterday. They were slightly wrinkled from being in her carry-on, but presentable enough. She'd just finished lacing her shoes when a knock came at the door. Captain Nguyen stood in the hallway already in her flight suit, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Good morning, Dr. Chen. I hope I'm not too early?" "Not at all, Captain. I'm an early riser." This wasn't strictly true anymore. Retirement had finally broken Lynn of the habit of 5 a.m. wake-ups, but today was different. "Great. If you've had breakfast, we can head to the hangar now. If not, the mess hall is open." "I'm fine, thank you. Lead the way." They walked through the quiet base, morning dew still clinging to the grass beside the sidewalks. Other airmen and officers they passed nodded respectfully or saluted Captain Nguyen, but Lynn noticed many of them giving her curious glances as well. Word of her presence had clearly spread. "The rest of the flight crew is already at the hangar," Nguyen explained as they walked. "We're doing a standard training run today, formation flying with some simulated combat scenarios." "How many hours do you have in the F-22? Lynn asked, genuinely curious about the pilot's experience. "Just over 500, Nguyen replied with obvious pride. "I've been flying Raptors for 3 years now. Before that I was in F-16s. Quite a difference, I imagine." Nguyen's face lit up, like comparing a sports car to a spaceship. "The first time I broke Mach 1 in the F-22, it was so smooth I didn't even realize we'd done it until I checked my instruments. The handling is incredible. It's like the aircraft can read your mind." Lynn smiled at the pilot's enthusiasm. She'd heard similar comments from the test pilots back during the development phase, but there was something special about hearing it from someone who flew the finished product as part of their daily life. They rounded a corner, and ahead of them loomed a massive hangar with its doors open to the morning light. Inside, Lynn could make out the distinctive shapes of aircraft, their sleek lines unmistakable even at a distance. "There they are," Nguyen said softly, a note of reverence in her voice. "The finest fighter aircraft ever built." As they approached the hangar, Lynn felt her heart rate increase. It had been so long since she'd been this close to the culmination of her life's most important work. In her consulting role, she reviewed designs and suggested improvements, but she rarely saw the finished products. Inside the hangar, 3 F-22 Raptors sat in a row, their dark gray surfaces absorbing the light rather than reflecting it, one of the many stealth features built into every aspect of their design. Ground crews moved around the aircraft, running final checks before the morning flight. Lynn stopped just inside the hangar doors, taking in the scene. The aircraft were both familiar and new to her. She recognized the fundamental design, the careful angles and curves that she had spent years perfecting, but the finished planes were more beautiful than the prototypes and models she had worked with. "Dr. Chen." A tall man in a flight suit approached, his hand extended. "Lieutenant Colonel Richard Takahashi, Squadron Commander. It's an honor to have you visit our hangar." Lynn shook his hand. "The honor is mine, Colonel. Your aircraft are beautiful. They're incredible machines," Takahashi agreed, looking back at the fighters with unmistakable pride. "But I think you know that better than anyone." Would you like a closer look? Very much. Takahashi led her toward the nearest F-22, where a small group of pilots and ground crew had gathered. As they approached, the group fell silent, all eyes turning to Lin. She recognized some of the pilots from the officers' club the night before. Everyone, Takahashi announced. This is Dr. Lin Chen, one of the key developers of the stealth technology that makes our birds so special. Dr. Chen is visiting us courtesy of a diverted commercial flight, so let's show her what her work has become. A young ground crew chief stepped forward. Ma'am, would you like to see the aircraft up close? Lin nodded and the group moved toward the nearest Raptor. Up close, the fighter was even more impressive. A perfect blend of form and function, every curve and angle designed with a specific purpose. The radar cross-section is still classified, right? Lin asked, running her fingers lightly over the aircraft's surface. Yes, ma'am, Takahashi confirmed, but I can tell you it's still the lowest of any operational fighter in the world. These planes disappear from enemy radar at ranges where they can already see and target the opposition. It's like having a superpower. The pilots took turns showing Lin different aspects of the aircraft, pointing out features and telling stories about the Raptor's capabilities. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and Lin found herself asking questions and sharing insights about why certain design choices had been made. The angles of the vertical stabilizers were one of our biggest challenges, she explained to an attentive group. We needed them to provide stability without creating corner reflectors for radar. The solution involved mathematics that didn't even exist when we started the project. Is it true you developed new equations specifically for this aircraft? One young pilot asked. Lin nodded. Several. Some of them are still classified, I believe. They are, confirmed a new voice. General Wilson had entered the hangar and joined the group. Good morning, Lin. I see you've met our Raptor team. Good morning, Grace. Yes, they've been very welcoming, Wilson smiled. I thought they might be. These pilots understand better than most what your work means in practical terms. A call came from across the hangar. It was time for the pilots to begin their pre-flight procedures. Captain Nguyen gave Lin an apologetic look. Dr. Chen, we need to prepare for takeoff. Would you like to watch the flight from the control tower? You'll have a great view of the aircraft in action. I'd like that very much, Lin replied. As the pilots moved away to begin their preparations, General Wilson touched Lin's arm. Before you go up to the tower, there's something I'd like to show you. She led Lin to a small room off the main hangar floor, an office with a desk and several filing cabinets. Wilson unlocked one of the cabinets and pulled out a thick binder with classified markings on the cover. This is the current technical manual for the F-22's stealth systems, she explained, setting it on the desk. Most of it is still classified, but I have clearance to show it to you since you wrote half of it anyway. Lin opened the binder carefully, scanning the familiar diagrams and equations. Many had been refined since her time on the project, but the core principles remained exactly as she had developed them. Turn to page 94, Wilson suggested. Lin flipped to the indicated page and stopped, surprised to find her own name in the text. A small section titled Historical Note contained a brief paragraph. The core mathematical principles of the F-22's radar evading capabilities were developed by Dr. Lin Chen and her team at Advanced Research Projects in 2003-2005. Dr. Chen's revolutionary approach to surface geometry calculations, now known as Chen's method, remains the foundation of modern stealth technology. Lin stared at the page, unexpectedly moved by this small acknowledgement, buried in a classified manual that few would ever see.